So, Matthew Desmond, the book Evicted, there was so much in it, and I didn't know any of this to begin with. I was really very thankful that I had been given this opportunity to read and think about that book, and to try to come up with a way to make art about that book. Now, visual arts are interesting in themselves because they give you another way to communicate. And reading a book or writing a book is one way, but making art is another. And there are several advantages to trying to distill ideas into an image. One of them is that without words, you have to think in a different way and maybe produce something that is all-encompassing with one vision or a few visions instead of a whole book. So I tried to condense what I had learned into one piece of art. And I'm going to show you that piece of art now, and I'm going to invite you to try your own hand at this if you like. I will lead you through the steps. So this is my piece here. It's called Evicted, like the book. And this is how I was thinking the book led me to this idea. First of all, it was going to have to be not a happy painting, right? It's going to have to be thoughtful and not happy, but it's going to have a lot of ideas tied together. And my first idea was this. I tend to sketch things out on Post-it notes. First idea was this. It looked like a tornado. There was a lot of movement going on. A tornado that got bigger and bigger below and above. This is the idea I eventually went with. Still the tornado. You can see the tornado here, lots of movement. But up above, it was hopeful. There are, let me just put these little Post-it notes here. So this part would be eviction, where a lot of factors are coming together. Eviction or near eviction at this point. And if you get help, you have a chance of escaping the tornado. The tornado is coming. So if you get sucked into the tornado part, you've got problems. The author says that eviction leads to poverty and not the other way around. It's not the poverty that leads to eviction, but eviction is a cause, not just a condition of poverty. Losing your home, possessions, and often your job, and having an eviction record leads to denial for government housing assistance, relocating to degrading housing in unsafe neighborhoods, increased suffering from depression, illness, and homelessness, and poverty could pile on. This is a quote from the author. Living in poverty often meant steering through gnarled thickets of interconnected misfortunes. So down here, I was picturing a lot of swirling around, interconnectedness, but not in a good way. A lot of ways you could just not ever get out of this situation. On the other hand, there was, near the end of the book, some hopeful ideas. And again, these are pointed out by the author. There are federally funded housing choice voucher programs in effect now, and there's public housing. Those are the two biggest ones in the U.S., the author is pushing for the rest of the, as he calls it, unlucky majority to have a universal voucher program so that everybody would be able to have access to low-income housing in a decent neighborhood and to be able to live with respect and dignity. So his idea is that because, well, you can read the book. There's a lot of different reasons why once you fall into this area of gripping poverty, that it's very difficult to get out. But if we can avoid that problem to begin with, and the problem is often started because a vast majority of a person's income goes to the rent. So if you don't have to worry about the rent, you have a lot more security, less depression, less stress, and you're able to put more money towards food, have ways to better yourself through education, and of course have more money for your family. So the kids would benefit. They wouldn't have to be moved around so much because a lot of the eviction process is detrimental, of course, to the children because people have to move and then they have to move again to get out of their bad situation and they have to move again. So it really causes just this giant turmoil in both the neighborhoods and in the person's self. So this piece of artwork is about that book. And I used an abstract approach. I don't think I would have been able to paint this idea without taking it very abstractly. And so again, I wanted that storm to be represented in this piece of work. And I chose the tornado because I felt like that churning and just so all that turmoil, if I could harness that into a painting and show all of the movement down here, disjointed movement. It's not coordinated movement, it's all disjointed. But yet, if we went the other direction, there was hope. And yellow is the psychology of color here. I'm using the psychology of color because yellow is the color often chosen to represent hope. So if you go upwards, and notice how the creases here are all going in one direction, they're kind of going outward, whereas the ones down here are just all jumbled up and not going anywhere at all. Okay, this is stuck. This is leading towards a hopeful situation. And I did this piece of artwork with tissue paper and glue and watercolor paints. And I'm going to show you the process that I used. I'm going to start by telling you which materials you would use if you wanted to replicate something like this. I have a piece of cardboard. This is actually a scrap mat board piece measuring about 8 inches by 11. The measurements, of course, aren't important, but that's what I've got here. I wanted something that was stiff enough that I could put glue on it, watered down glue, and the whole thing wouldn't sort of become very floppy because I need some structure here. I also needed a piece of white tissue paper. So go ahead and grab some tissue. This is just like the tissue paper you would use in gift wrapping. I needed my watercolor paints. Whenever I use my watercolor paints, of course, I need a brush and some water to rinse my brush with. Usually I use 2 containers of water because if you rinse your brush once, you can rinse it again in the clear water and then tap it to a paper towel. And you'll know it's clean because no color will come out of the paintbrush at that time. So of course we need paper towels as well. But today, especially, I would have used 2 glasses of water because I'm going to be using black paint and yellow paint. And I never want my black to get into the yellow by accident, but instead I've got a jar of diluted glue in my second container here. So I'll just be very careful about rinsing my brush. So I'm using Elmer's glue to glue the tissue paper down, and I'm using about a 1-to-1 ratio of Elmer's glue and water. And I'm swirling that around so that's ready to go. I also have, I'm using 3 paintbrushes today. So I've got the paintbrush that I will use in my artwork. I've got this very cheap paintbrush that's wider, but very good for putting on color very quickly and very good for putting glue on the cardboard. You do not want to use a nice paintbrush when you're working with glue. Okay, so that's my cheap paintbrush. I also have another cheap paintbrush that's not quite as fat, and it's stiffer. I use this one for putting on my finishing. This is an acrylic gloss liquid that I can paint over the finished artwork, and it will help preserve it, and also it will help keep the colors looking bright. So we've done the tissue paper, the cardboard, the paints, the brushes, the water, the glue, the finishing, and more paintbrushes. Let's get started. So to do this piece, I wanted to make sure that I had that appearance of a tornado. So I started out thinking, how am I going to get that? And I think you can see here, I hope, that it's actually twisted. Let me get these out of the way. So I twisted, this is all tissue paper that's glued on to give this texture here. I twisted the tissue paper in the center there to get this. But when I tried it with the piece of tissue, twisting it in the middle here was really going to be too bulky. And so I started out by taking some of that away. Tissue paper rips, as you know, very easily. So I just ripped some pieces out and discarded them. Ripping from both sides gave me a shape something like this. And then very carefully, I can twist the center bit. Of course, it's going to want to tear in every way at this point, so you have to do it carefully. And then you can see that now, the tornado coming on. So that's how I got that. And as you twist it more, you can really start seeing that paper pulling up into that. And I really wanted to see that because that looks like the storm. Now at the top here, I'm just going to do this on the gray so that you can see it easier. On the top, if I hold this and gently pull at the tissue paper, I can start to get this look here where everything is going in the same direction. You can just crease that down. And at the bottom, this more crazy and disjointed area was made like this. And I also ripped some pieces into the edges. Now these aren't necessary. You could cut them off if they bother you, but I thought it just really added to that feeling of chaos. I mean, getting evicted must just be horrible. Okay, so now I'm going to take my piece of cardboard. It's actually discarded mats. And I'm going to take my diluted glue. Again, this is a 1-to-1 mix of glue and water. I'm going to take my cheap paintbrush and I'm just going to cover this mat board. With a generous amount. Now I'm going to start with top, because I want this part of my tornado to be about 2/3 from the bottom. So I'm going to position that first and give it a twist. And then stick that down. And then down here, I'm just going to start crumpling this randomly onto the mat board. And these little bits, I want to make sure that they're all random too. And if you get some of that tissue paper tearing, no worries. You can glue it. It won't show after the paint goes on anyways. Just going to put a little bit of glue over the top. Make sure this is stuck down well. The more random this part is, the better. Now I'm going to take some diluted black, very dilute, and I'm going to paint over the whole thing. So I'm going to take my big brush and some black paint, and I want it to be very dilute. So I'm going to put some of the pigment here in the lid. I'm going to add some water to it. I'm going to start putting that over. And you can see what happens. It really brings out the texture. I'll try to not do too much here at the moment because I want those areas to be blue. It almost looks like roots at this point. The tangle of eviction. I'm going to put a little bit of blue on here, and then I'm going to let it dry for a couple minutes. Maybe longer. I'm using my smaller brush now because I want to have a little bit more control. I just want to have some blue here to sort of delineate the hope from the despair. And if some of the blue gets too close to the tissue, that's okay. You'll see what happens. The color will be pulled along into it, just like the black was pulled along into the tissue paper. It's basically the pigment's going to run along the crease lines. And if you've ever done tie-dye, it's a very similar thing that happens in tie-dye. The pigment will want to run along the creases. Okay, so I'm going to let this dry for a few minutes, maybe 20 minutes, and I'll be back. I'll see you soon. Okay, I'm back. And let me just take a look at this and tell you that you can see it's warping, but it will flatten out again as it dries. I know because I did this one yesterday and it's perfectly flat. Okay, so we're going to work with this now, and I need to put some yellow up here. I'm going to start with the yellow, and yeah, I think I'll use this brush here. This is a good brush for putting lots of color on quickly. And hopefully the blue in the water isn't going to affect the yellow too much. Normally I would clean the water before going into yellow. Lots of water in there so that the paint will move easily. I'm just going to overlay the top layer with yellow. And now I'm going to start looking at some of these darker colors. I'm going to go to my watercolor brush, and I'm going to start putting in some darker colors down here. And I'm going to be painting the shapes. Like, can you see that square there? In that shape. I'm going to start by painting some of these shapes in with the darker colors. And there's going to be more of them up here. I think by the time we get down to this area, you've been sucked in here and bounced around so much. There's not much color down here. There is some yellow dotted here and there because not everything about these. When I read the book, I was struck by some very good people having been in very bad situations. So there are flicks of hope here and there. I'm just going to start with a couple of these yellows. These represent people that were helping each other. When you put the color down, you're going to notice it again moving along the creases of the paper. I like that effect, and I'm just going to let it happen. If you don't see that happening and you want to see that happening, add a little bit more water to your paints so that your brush is fairly wet and the paint runs from the brush very easily. At that point, you'll have enough pigment to sort of follow your crease lines. I'm going to put some up here too. I'll put a little bit up here. Again, with the purple, same thing. I want to have enough pigment that the color is going to flow easily. And for some reason, the pigment always is harder to resuspend in the purple. I like it when the colors are flowing enough that they start to mingle outside their shapes. And you can see that they run along the crease lines and kind of emphasize the lines as you work. There's that shape there. I'm trying to remember to keep my hand out of the way of the light. Sometimes I forget though, so sorry if I'm blocking my hand at some points. If the shadow is, I mean. I'll put a couple of those purple bits up here too. The blue is pretty easy to resuspend, and it's been sitting there in water since we did this part, so we don't have to mix it up too much. And it's nice to have some blue in there too, in this area in between the papers. And put some blue in there. And now I'm going to jump over to the black and just put some black in here too. Again, you'll see the color running along the crease lines. If you have more water, it'll move a lot easier. Okay, this piece is nearly finished. As it dries, it's going to flatten down and it's going to lighten up because watercolors tend to dry lighter than when they're in liquid form. And of course, when they lighten, these beautiful patterns aren't going to show up as well because there won't be so much contrast between the dark and the light. And so that's why I put the acrylic glaze on top. It will just help the colors stay a little bit brighter, and it will also protect the artwork somewhat. These bits that hang off, if you don't like them, you can just tear them or cut them away. But for me, I like to keep them on there because it kind of adds to the whole sense of what I feel like these people must be experiencing when handed an eviction notice. Can you imagine? Here's my piece. I hope that was inspiring or at least instructional. I hope this process made you think about what people are going through when they face eviction. And if you really want to know more about it, I highly recommend this book. It was an amazing book. Again, it's Matthew Desmond, and he, about universal vouchers, let me just read this so I don't get it wrong. He says a universal voucher program. So this is more than just the vouchers that he writes about in the book, but he advocates a universal voucher program where families would immediately feel the income gains and be able to buy enough food, invest in themselves and their children through schooling or job training, and start a modest savings. They would find stability and have a sense of ownership over their home and their community. Okay, that would be awesome. These programs are designed so that 30% of the family's income would go towards their rent and 70% would go towards everything else. Whereas the way things are at the moment, a lot of renters who are living in substandard housing are paying a vast amount of their income towards their rent. and it's very difficult to get out of that situation. So, with that, I'm going to close this episode of Woke Art, and I will see you next time. We will be learning about African American voices on February 11th. See you then. Bye.